Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Chuck Dixon. I am the president of the Haywood County unit of the NAACP, and I'd like to welcome everyone here to Jones Temple, AME Zion Church. We meet here occasionally and hopefully on a regular basis, and it's great to have you here. This is actually our first vice president's church. Reverend Staley is the minister here, but he's at a AME Zion conference today, so he's not with us. For those of you who don't know, the president of the Jackson County NAACP is here. It's Enrique Gomez. He's here. And I tell you what, there's lots of Jackson. You brought a big delegation with you. Would you raise your hand if you're from Jackson County? All right. And again, welcome and thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to assume the other folks that didn't raise their hands are from Haywood County. Is that's right? So again, thank you very much for coming and doing this today. We look forward to experiencing the program. And afterwards, we have refreshments downstairs, and there's coffee and drinks and cookies and a few other things. And we'd love to get to know you a little bit better, because I think there are things, and maybe lots of things, that the Haywood and Jackson branches can possibly do together, and ways we can work together to further the cause that we are working on. But anyway, thank you again for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to Janice Inabinet, who will lead the program here, and enjoy.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. One of the things that happened was that you told me that we were going to start at 2:45. And so I told everybody that we were starting at 2:45. Well, not starting on Indian time around here, as we call it back where I come from. So there might be some people that come in, and so we will welcome them also. What we've put together today is what I call an experiential storytelling experience. I'm a storyteller, and some time ago, I had the opportunity to be a storyteller for an organization that had an audience of 90 people in it. And I was so excited I was going to get to tell before these 90 people. And I was sitting at the back of the room, and as I walked, after they called my name, I walked forward. I went, "You have got some nerve to think that you've got something to say to these people. These people out here have the real story." And as a result, I changed my whole head around. It was an epiphany for me. I changed my whole head around. And so I enjoy very much doing experiential audience participation work. This is going to be painless. We have written the script for you, so you don't have to know it all by yourself. And I would ask a couple of things. One, that you check your cell phones and make sure that they are off. Number one, you know where it is. Yeah. I don't even know where mine is. I hope I left it in the car. And the other thing is that for those of you readers, does everybody have a card to read so that you can participate? Everybody that wants to read? For those of you that are readers, if you have a card with a blue tag, that means that you are among the 101 to 110. So if yours has a 4 on it, that means that you're 104. Okay, and then all the others are marked accordingly, but the blue tags are the ones. And with that little bit of housekeeping, and I hope my phone isn't the one that goes off, we'll get started. Does anybody, one other little piece of housekeeping, we are videoing this. Does anybody opposed to being videoed? Okay. You will be in 4 skits today. The first skit, does everybody have a program? The first skit is called Beginnings in the New World. Democracy suggests a climate of opportunity, mutual respect, and understanding that engenders a feeling that the future should be shared by all community members. There is an absence of discrimination and harassment based on age, color, disability, ethnic origin, marital status, race, religious beliefs, sex, veteran status, and the rich diversity of people, their cultures, and the bond that ties people together are appreciated and celebrated. Real democracy means that all people are included in the phrase, "we the people." Americans of African descent believe that democracy is an attitude of self-respect, a commitment to dismantle structures of exploitation, and a dedication to building just structures and cultures in their place. Building a real democracy means recognizing that the structures of violence we are fighting have harmed and targeted some groups much more than others. We know that changes in societies require a constant renewal and expansion of knowledge and skills for all people. Our work as Americans of African descent has been and continues to be to stand, to sit, to march, to sing, to write, to rap, to preach, to act, to entertain, to teach. You will find us at home. You will find us in community, on the street, at the polls, as well as in the halls of Congress. Join me today on this exploration of some of the people, places, and things that have influenced or been influenced by Americans of African American descent in the continuing quest for democracy in the New World. May I have readers 1 through 10? One here.
The transatlantic slave trade. When the Portuguese first sailed down the Atlantic African coast in the 1430s, they were interested in one thing, gold. By 1500, they had traded 81,000 Africans to Europe, nearby Atlantic islands, and to Muslim merchants in Africa. Expanding European empires in the New World lacked one major resource, a workforce. The result was the infamous triangular trade and the horrors experienced by Africans on the Middle Passage. The total number of African deaths directly attributable to the Middle Passage voyage is estimated at up to 2 million.
Slave ship. Throughout the height of the Atlantic slave trade from 1570 to 1808, slave ships were normally smaller than the traditional cargo ships, with most slave ships weighing between 150 and 250 tons. This equated to about 350 to 450 enslaved Africans on each slave ship. An estimated 15% of the Africans died at sea.
The first recorded Africans in British North America, which includes most of the future United States, were, quote, 20 and odd Negroes, unquote, who came to Jamestown, Virginia via Cape Comfort in August 1619 as indentured servants. As English settlers died from harsh conditions, more and more Africans were brought to work as laborers. Typically, young men or women would sign a contract of indenture in exchange for transportation to the New World. Africans could legally raise crops and cattle to purchase their freedom. They raised families, marrying other Africans and sometimes intermarrying with Native Americans or English settlers. By the 1640s and 1650s, several African families owned farms around the Jamestown area, and some became wealthy by colonial standards and purchased indentured servants of their own.
A fellow named John Punch lived in Virginia around 1630 to 1640. He was an African, and in July of 1640, Virginia Governor's Council sentenced him to serve for the remainder of his life as punishment for having run away to Maryland. In contrast, 2 European men who also ran away with him were sentenced to longer indentures, but not to total loss of prospects for freedom. For this reason, historians consider John Punch the first official slave in the English colonies, and his case as the legal sanctioning of slavery, African slavery, lifelong in Chesapeake. Historians also consider this to be one of the first legal distinctions between Europeans and Africans made in the colony, and in his case, a key milestone in the development of the institution of slavery in the United States.
During the 1770s, Africans, both enslaved and free, helped rebellious English colonists secure American independence by defeating the British in the American Revolution.
The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, was a social movement during the first half of the 19th century, helping slaves to escape to freedom. It is a term applied to abolitionists, both black and white, free and enslaved, who aided the fugitive slaves. It engaged abolitionists committed to immediate and concrete action against slavery. It was a grassroots, spiritually influenced effort, and it facilitated the creation of the most potent weapon against social inequality, first-hand testimony on the evils of slavery.
Born a slave in 1797 on a Dutch plantation in Ulster County, New York, Isabella Bomefree fought her way to freedom and became an African-American abolitionist and women's rights activist. When her son Peter was sold south after slavery was abolished in New York State, she went to court and sued to get him returned north. She became the first black woman to win such a case against a white man. Her best-known extemporaneous speech on gender inequalities, "Ain't I a Woman?" was delivered in 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. We know her as Sojourner Truth.
Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. He was an African-American social reformer, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping from slavery, he became a leader of the abolitionist movement, gaining note for his dazzling oratory and incisive anti-slavery writing. He stood as a living counterexample to slaveholders' arguments that slaves lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens.
Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born in 1822, was an African-American abolitionist and humanitarian. Born into slavery, Tubman escaped and subsequently made about 13 missions to rescue approximately 70 enslaved families and friends, using a network of anti-slavery activists and safe house known as the Underground Railroad. During the American Civil War, Harriet was a Union spy. She died in 1913.
The Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. It proclaimed the freedom of slaves in the 10 states that were still in rebellion. It applied to more than 3 million of the 4 million slaves in the U.S. at that time.
Why don't we start with you? Come on.
The second segment of our program is the first Reconstruction and its aftermath. Did you know that in 1870 there were more African Americans in the North Carolina legislature than there are today? This was the result of a fusion political movement following the Civil War, in which Lincoln Republicans joined with former slaves and freedmen to rewrite state constitutions throughout the South. As our North Carolina NAACP president, Reverend William Barber II, puts it, the promise of Reconstruction was to reconstruct the nation to be closer to its nobler ideals. What is said on paper, not what it has done in practice. In 1868, North Carolina's Constitution was rewritten by these fusionists with those ideals in mind. And in 1870, the African Americans in our legislature joined with progressive white lawmakers to pass some of the most progressive legislation related to education, labor, voting, and criminal justice our state has ever known. However, by 1872, the violent reaction from former planters across the South, led to the growth of what became known as the redemptive movement, aimed at redeeming the South and America from the influence of black political power and stopping fusion politics. This period gave birth to the Ku Klux Klan, and following the coup d'etat in Wilmington in 1898, in which a duly elected biracial city government was violently overthrown and run not just out of office but also out of town, white supremacists took over our state's legislature, and white supremacy was rewritten into the laws of the state. They attacked 5 specific areas of legislation: education, labor, criminal justice, taxes. They cut taxes to make sure that there was not enough revenue to fulfill the promises that had been made to the former slaves. And voting rights, giving rise to poll taxes and Jim Crow laws, which virtually eliminated black voting power by 1910. Does this sound familiar to any of you, just observing patterns of behavior within today's North Carolina General Assembly? While most Americans think of Reconstruction as a single phenomenon which occurred in the South immediately following the Civil War, according to Annabelle Park of Story of America, each time there has been a demographic shift in America that threatens the existing balance of power, new election laws have appeared to try to insulate the electorate from the emerging population. The most obvious demographic shift threatening the balance of power was emancipation. With it came the right to vote for African American men, which was decisive in southern states where former slaves far outnumbered whites. This was considered unacceptable, and starting in 1874, a wave of political violence and terrorism, which until recently was celebrated as heroic terrorism, overthrew democratically elected governments and rigged elections in order to install voting restrictions and other practices which barred African Americans from voting in the South for 80 years. This period is now considered by many civil rights leaders, including Reverend Barber, as but the first of 3 Reconstruction periods in our nation's quest for the noble ideals of democracy. So I'd like to ask the 7 folks who have cards that are numbered 201 through 207 to come line up behind me now. with one on this far end chronologically that way.
The 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was ratified on February 3rd, 1870.
The first Reconstruction. Reconstruction addressed how the 11 seceding states would regain what the Constitution calls a republican form of government and be reseated in Congress, the civil status of the former leaders of the Confederacy, and the constitutional and legal status of freedmen, especially their civil rights and whether they should be given the right to vote. Intense controversy erupted throughout the South over these issues. President Abraham Lincoln set up reconstructed governments in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana during the war. He experimented by giving land to former slaves in South Carolina. Congress removed civilian governments in the South in 1867 and put the former Confederacy under the rule of the U.S. Army. Reconstruction programs included funding public schools, establishing charitable institutions, raising taxes, and offering massive aid to support improved railroad transportation and shipping. Opponents call Reconstruction corrupt and instigated violence toward freedmen and whites who supported it. Much of the violence was carried out by members of the Ku Klux Klan, a secret terrorist organization. With the compromise of 1877, Army intervention in the Southeast.
Founded in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan extended into almost every southern state by 1870, and it became a vehicle for white Southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction-era policies that were aimed at establishing political and economic equality for blacks. Its members waged an underground campaign of intimidation and violence that were directed at white and black Republican leaders. Though Congress passed legislation designed to curb Klan terrorism, the organization saw its primary goal, which was the reestablishment of white supremacy, fulfilled through Democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. After a period of decline, white Protestant nativist groups revived the Klan in the early 20th century, burning crosses and staging rallies, parades, and marches denouncing immigrants, Catholics, Jews, blacks, and organized labor. The civil rights movement of the 1960s also saw a surge of Ku Klux Klan activity, including bombings of black schools and churches, and violence against black and white activists in the South.
Jim Crow laws. The origin of the phrase Jim Crow has often been attributed to Jump Jim Crow, a song and dance caricature of blacks performed by white actor Thomas D. Rice in blackface, which first surfaced in 1832 and was used to satirize Andrew Jackson's populist policies. As a result of Rice's fame, Jim Crow, by 1838, had become a pejorative expression meaning Negro. When the Southern legislature passed laws of racial segregation directed against blacks at the end of the 19th century, these became known as Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were state and local racial segregation laws enacted after the Reconstruction period in the southern United States that continued in force until 1965, mandating racial segregation in all public facilities in the southern U.S. states, starting in 1890 with a separate but equal status for African Americans. It institutionalized a number of economic, educational, social disadvantages for African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson, this is an 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights had been violated was rejected. In an 1892 incident, a Louisiana law upheld a Jim Crow law allowing for separate but equal rights in public facilities. The court's ruling stated that a state law, which merely implies a legal distinction between whites and blacks, did not conflict with the 13th and 14th Amendments. Restrictive legislation based on race continued. Its reasoning was not overturned until 1954.
The Wilmington Insurrection of 1898. The Wilmington coup d'etat, also known as the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 or the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898, began in Wilmington, North Carolina on November the 10th, 1898, and continued for several days. It is considered a turning point in the post-Reconstruction North Carolina politics. The event is credited as ushering in an era of severe racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans throughout the southeastern United States. Laura Edwards wrote in Democracy Betrayed in the year 2000, what happened in Wilmington became an affirmation of white supremacy, not just in that one city, but in the South and in the nation as a whole. Originally described by European Americans as a race riot, suggesting that African Americans were at fault, the events are now classified as a coup d'etat as white Democratic Party insurgents overthrew the legitimately elected local government. A mob of nearly 2,000 men attacked only black newspaper in the state and persons of property in black neighborhoods, killing an estimated 15 or more than 60 victims.
Lynchings. For many African Americans growing up in the South in the 19th and 20th centuries, the threat of lynching was commonplace. The popular image of an angry white mob stringing a black man up to a tree is only half the story. Lynching, an act of terror meant to spread fear among blacks, served the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in the economic, social, and political spheres. Although the practice of lynching has existed since before slavery, it gained momentum during Reconstruction when viable black towns sprang up across the South and African Americans began to make political and economic inroads by registering to vote, establishing businesses, and running for public office. Many white landowners and poor whites felt threatened by this rise in black prominence. Foremost on their mind was a fear of sex between the races. Some whites espoused the idea that black men were sexually predators and wanted integration in order to be with white women. In the South, an estimated 2 or 3 blacks were lynched each week in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In Mississippi alone, 500 blacks were lynched from the 1800s to the 1955. Nationwide, the figure climbed to nearly 5,000. According to black journalist and editor Ida B. Wells, who launched the fierce anti-lynching campaign in the 1890s, the lynching of successful black people was a means of subordinating political black economic competitors. Wells, who would later help found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was forced to flee Memphis after her offices were torched.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is an African American civil rights organization in the United States, which was founded on February the 12th, 1909, the date chosen to coincide with the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln. It emerged from the Niagara movement, so named because since U.S. hotels were segregated by race, its participants initially met in a hotel on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls. The purpose of that early movement was to address the particular challenges faced by people of color in the United States, specifically voter disenfranchisement, segregation, and lynching. Under the leadership of Harvard professor W.E.B. Du Bois, the movement soon drew progressive white journalists and social workers into its ranks, including Mary White Ovington, for whom our own NAACP is named. The Associated delimited its charter mission to promote the equality of rights and to eradicate class or race prejudice among the citizens of the United States, to advance the interest of colored people, to secure for them impartial suffrage, and to increase their opportunities for securing justice in the courts, education for their children, employment according to their ability, and complete equality under the laws. In its infancy, the NAACP focused its efforts on using the courts to overturn Jim Crow laws, and it's devoted much of its energy for over a decade between the two world wars to fighting lynching and seeking federal legislation barring widespread practice. Its mission: to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all persons, and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination.
The time in our country's history that most of us remember as the Civil Rights Movement has also been called the Second Reconstruction. Historians credit the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, with opening the floor for the civil rights protesters in the latter 50s and the 60s. For the following years and after the long months of struggle and strategic deliberations and intensive training that preceded their direct actions and peaceful protest, after that, the activists came to face the violence that they had known pretty much all along they were going to be risking. The ability of those people who were involved with withstanding and persevering became a spark for all of us, a catalyst. It was also called the Awakening, and it had begun not only across our nation. The world now had become a witness. Next up in this performance today are 6 bold and buoyant and brilliant illustrations of this era, the Civil Rights Movement. First, we're going to hear, though, about Brown versus the Board of Education and the Supreme Court decision that birthed this period, known as, once again, the Second Reconstruction. And will the people who are going to read cards 301 through 308 please come forward now. 301 to 308.
On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled unanimously in this landmark case. Brown overturned provisions of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which had allowed for separate but equal public facilities, including public schools in the United States. Brown versus Board further declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This decision helped break the back of the state-sponsored segregation.
The Highlander Center was founded in 1932 in New Market, Tennessee, as both a cultural center and a school for social justice training. During the 50s, it played a critical role in developing leadership in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks had studied at Highland Center just 4 months before her refusal to give up her seat, which led to her subsequent arrest in Montgomery, Alabama. Among other Highlander trainees who made significant contributions to the civil rights movement are members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Septima Clark, Ann Braden, Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, Hollis Watkins, Bernard Lafayette, Ralph Abernathy, and John Lewis. All of this was in the mid and late 50s.
Beginning in December 1955, for 3 months, this citywide boycott helped launch nationwide efforts to end segregation of public facilities, after which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses is unconstitutional. The Montgomery Improvement Association coordinated the boycott with stringent, unwavering discipline, using carpools to sustain itself where needed. Its president, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., became a prominent civil rights leader with international attention focused on Montgomery. The boycott clearly demonstrated how nonviolent mass protests could successfully challenge racial injustice.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Young leaders of the sit-in protest movement developed this group in April 1960. They remained totally and fiercely independent of MLK and the Southern Leadership Conference in two significant ways. SNCC generated its own projects, such as testing unconstitutional segregation in interstate travel facilities, and its own strategies. Their grassroots organizing was based on shared leadership. SNCC was the ground where young black and white people, working under the most intimate and circumstance, first learned to love each other.
Birmingham. In the spring of '63, after the lunch counter sit-ins, marches on city halls and boycotts on the downtown merchants defying segregation laws had begun. Peaceful demonstrations were met with violent attacks from the local authorities. The use of high-pressure fire hoses and police dogs on men, women, children produced for the world the ironic, troubling images of the civil rights movement. One of the major turning points on the civil rights movement, Birmingham was called the beginning of the end of hundreds of years in the struggle for freedom.
16th Street church bombing. On September 15th, 1963, a bomb exploded at a predominantly black church in Birmingham, Alabama. This Baptist church also served as a frequent meeting place for civil rights leaders. By 1963, homemade bombs set off in Birmingham's black homes and churches were such common occurrences that the city had earned the label Bombingham. That Sunday, however, it was 4 young girls, ages 11 to 16 years, who were killed. Many other people were injured. Outrage over the incident and the violent clash between protesters and police that followed helped to show the entire nation how heartlessly dangerous the struggle for civil rights had become for African Americans.
Selma to Montgomery. On February 18, 1965, 50 years ago, state troopers joined the Marion, Alabama police to end an evening march. In the ensuing clash, a 26-year-old church deacon, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was fatally shot. Thousands of activists in Marion and nearby Selma soon set out to march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. On March 25th, Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent followers finally reached the Capitol steps in Montgomery. After a 5-day, 54-mile march from Selma, the site where local African Americans had been campaigning with the Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference for voting rights.
The Edmund Pettus Bridge is the world-famous landmark of the protest rally from Selma to Montgomery. Thousands set out on March 7th after Jackson had been shot. When the protesters reached Pettus Bridge, they faced a blockade of state troopers and local lawmen who ordered them to disperse back to Selma. Cheered on by white onlookers, the troopers chased the steadfast marchers off the bridge, attacking them with clubs and tear gas. Ultimately, after retreats and restarts, and in spite of a pending court order, King left Selma on March 21st, leading marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, this time with a federal sanction. By the time they reached Montgomery, the number of demonstrators had swelled to 25,000. The 50th anniversary of this historic achievement is this month.
Thank you, Chuck, for that very kind introduction earlier. Thank you, Haywood County NAACP, for hosting us in this space. And also, thank you to Jones Temple AME Zion Church for hosting and sharing this beautiful space with us. The Bridge to the Future, the third reconstruction. At the beginning of the 21st century, we have seen the election of the first African-American president who is president for all Americans. This has been countered by the push of the Tea Party and the powerful money interests who have supported the election of ideologically regressive individuals. We have seen the election of state assemblies that seek to overturn critical aspects of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which will disenfranchise and disempower people of color. As a result, we find ourselves in the middle of a third reconstruction where broad coalitions led by the NAACP and the historic thousands on John Street People's Assembly are fighting back to speak up for the disenfranchised and those left behind by ideologically driven laws. We have seen the rise of the Moral Mondays, which will continue until just and fair laws are passed. The journey of the African American community is in many aspects also the story about the human race. We see in this minority not just a preoccupation for political action, but also caring for our common humanity. We recognize the human drive to create, to explore, to protect, prosper, and to look to the stars. African Americans are artists, scientists, and scholars, people who reflect deeply about the nature of human experience. We see this in the work of astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson and astronaut Mae Jemison, the inspiration to see a great future for humanity amongst the stars. And at this point, I would like to thank those of you who have volunteered to read for the following cards, and I want to invite you to come forward and read those cards for us. So if you could start with 401 on this end and end up with 406 on this end. Thank you.
President Barack Obama. Barack Hussein Obama II, born August 4, 1961, is the 44th and current President of the United States and the first African American to hold the office. Born in Honolulu, Hawaii, Obama is a graduate of Columbia University and Harvard Law School, where he served as president of the Harvard Law Review. He was a community organizer in Chicago before earning his law degree. He worked as a civil rights attorney and taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School from 1992 to 2004. He served 3 terms representing the 13th District in the Illinois State Senate from 1997 to 2004, running unsuccessfully for the United States House of Representatives in 2000. In 2004, Obama received national attention during his campaign to represent Illinois in the United States Senate with his victory in the March Democratic Party primary, his keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in July, and his election to the Senate in November. He defeated Republican nominee John McCain in the general election and was inaugurated as president on January the 20th, 2009. 9 months after his election, Obama was named the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Obama was re-elected president in November 2012, defeating Republican nominee Mitt Romney, and was sworn in for a second term in January 2013.
Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Reverend Dr. William Barber II is the president of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP 2005, national board member and national NAACP chair of the Legislature Political Action Committee. Reverend Barber serves as a convener of the Forward Together Moral Movement and the HJON People's Assembly. Reverend Dr. Barber, along with local, state, and national NAACP leaders, has helped to lead the fight for voters' rights, just redistricting, healthcare reform, labor and workers' rights, protection of immigrant rights, and reparation for women survivors of eugenics, release of the Wilmington 10, and educational equality. Reverend Dr. Barber has been arrested 3 times for civil disobedience as he stood for educational, economic, and equal justice.
In December of 2006, under the leadership of HK-on-J convener Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, who also served as president of the North Carolina NAACP State Conference, HK-on-J held its first organized meeting with a diverse group of some of the state's best organizers, political scientists, lawyers, religious leaders, and activists. Less than 2 months later, HK-on-J kicked off its first annual HK-on-J People's Assembly in February of 2007, where more than 3,500 supporters attended as they sanctioned and signed the coalition's HK-on-J 14-point People's Agenda with detailed action steps. The HK-on-J coalition transformed the 14-point People's Agenda into comprehensive reform bills that have been introduced into legislative sessions.
Moral Mondays are protests in North Carolina. The protests are in response to several actions by the government of North Carolina, elected into office by the citizens of North Carolina in 2013. The protests are characterized by engaging in civil disobedience, by entering the state legislature building, and then being peacefully arrested. I'm so glad I brought with me. I went to jail with Reverend Barber. The movement protests many wide-ranging issues under the blanket of unfair treatment, discrimination, and adverse effects of government legislation on the citizens of North Carolina. The protests launched a grassroots social justice movement that in 2014 spread to Georgia and South Carolina, and then to other United States. Over 1,000 people were arrested in North Carolina during 2013 and 2014. All but 50 of those charged were exonerated in late summer of 2014 when the charges were dropped on constitutional grounds.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, born October 5th, 1958, is an African-American astrophysicist, cosmologist, author, and science communicator. He is currently the Frederick P. Rose Director of the Hayden Planetarium at the Rose Center for Earth and Space and a research associate in the Department of Astrophysics at the American Museum of Natural History. From 1995 to 2005, Tyson wrote the monthly Universe column for Natural History magazine. From 2006 to 2011, he hosted the educational television show Nova Science Now on PBS and has been a frequent guest on The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, and Real Time with Bill Maher. Since 2009, he has hosted the weekly radio show Star Talk. In 2014, he hosted the television series Cosmos, a space-time odyssey, which is a sequel to Carl Sagan's 1980 series Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, which has inspired millions to see the beauty of science and to seek a future among the stars.
Mae Jemison. Mae Carol Jemison, born October 17, 1956, became the first African American woman to travel in space when she went into orbit above the Space Shuttle Endeavour on September 12, 1992. After her medical education and a brief general practice, Jemison served in the Peace Corps from 1985 to 1987. When she was elected by NASA to join the astronaut corps, she resigned from NASA and in 1993 to form a company researching the application of technology to daily life. She has appeared on television several times, including as an actress in an episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation. She is a dancer and holds 9 honorary doctorates in science, engineering, letters, and the humanities. She is the current principal of the 100-year Starship Foundation. The goal of this is to create a business plan that can last 100 years in order to help foster the research needed for interstellar travel.
Please stand and give yourself a hand. The stars of our show. I've had the opportunity to listen to this show before. I've had the opportunity to work with a wonderful group of people that you met today as our narrators. Would you step forward? Mary is a member of your group here. Lucy from Jackson County, and of course, our president, Dr. Gomez. That I'm